Hello, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Samples, an attorney in Husch Blackwell's Higher Education Group. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your audience console, there are multiple application icons for your use during the program today. If you have any questions during the webcast, please submit them via the question box. We will try to answer all questions that we can during the webcast today, but if a fuller answer is needed or if we run out of time, we will make sure to answer your questions by email after the presentation. A PDF of the presentation is available in the resources folder. This program has been approved for continuing legal education hours, and to report your hours, you can click on the CEU icon at the bottom of the screen, and a certificate of attendance, including course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow, along with a recording of the webcast for watching and sharing. And towards the end of the program, be sure to complete our short survey. We use your feedback to plan future programs that are applicable to your institution and your business and operations and legal needs, so please make sure to submit any ideas you have for future programming. That's all for the housekeeping items, so let's get started with our program. Joining me today is Annie Cartwright and Lisa Hoskins. Annie works with public, private, nonprofit, and proprietary educational institutions, ranging from small nursing schools to national research universities and K-12 schools. She provides compliance audits, policy development, investigations, customized training, and general counsel services to help her clients navigate through the web of legal and regulatory requirements overlaying their operations. And Annie has invited me to share that in terms of practical experience, she has also completed her very first FAFSA for her eldest child. So very timely and related to our topic today. And Lisa serves as a federal student aid consultant for us here at Husch Blackwell. As a former institutional review specialist with the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Federal Student Aid, Lisa led and conducted numerous program reviews, and her experience also included a position as a financial aid manager at a public institution of higher education. So thank you both, Annie and Lisa, for presenting with me today. And without further ado, we'll get started. One quick disclaimer that we typically give is, we have a wide range of audience members here with us today, so we're going to try to cover these topics in a way that's meaningful to many of you, recognizing that you're wearing various hats at your institutions, perhaps more hats than before. And so we will try to, again, make sure that we're covering it in a way that is capturing these topics that's meaningful to those of you in a wide range of areas. So, in terms of our agenda today, we're going to discuss several aspects related to institutional and student funding. We're going to begin with the CARES Act, which was, of course, passed in response to COVID-19 pandemic. And we're going to talk about institutional administration of the grants and reporting requirements related to the grants under the CARES Act. Next, we're going to discuss several of the flexibilities announced by the Department of Education that relate to student assistance under Title IV as a result of COVID-19. And this will include announcements and updates related to distance education, return to Title IV, and federal work study. And then finally, we're going to provide a regulatory and enforcement update on a variety of topics, including foreign source reporting, professional licensure disclosures, borrower defense to repayment, and single-sex scholarships. Sorry, we're having a bit of technical difficulty. There we go. Okay, so by way of background, of course, the CARES Act, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, was passed on March 27th in a response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and was, of course, a significant stimulus package that related to various industries and included establishing funds for the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund, or HERF. And as we'll briefly review later, there are some additional stimulus legislation that has been proposed and is pending, but HERF is currently the main source of relief aid to higher education institutions. So, of course, this relief fund included approximately $14 billion in funds that were distributed to institutions based on percentage calculations of students at their institutions who were Pell Grant eligible and non-Pell Grant eligible. And this funding came in two main tranches, so a student portion and an institutional portion. And both the student portion and the institutional portion came under Section 18004A1, and institutions received these funds, and then we'll spend some time talking about administration and reporting related to those. And then just a quick note, under subsections A2 and A3, portions of HERF were designated to support existing programs under the Higher Education Act, and they awarded additional awards, for example, to historically Black colleges and universities, American Indian tribally controlled colleges, and minority-serving institutions, and then also established formula grants for other unmet needs. So as you'll note when we talk about reporting related to these various aspects of funding, there are particular expenditures and reporting related to these sections that we'll talk about briefly when we go through the form that has been provided from the Department of Education. So now we'll have our first poll question. So this question relates to the distribution of your student share of the funding that you've received. So what portion of your HERF student grant funds have you already dispersed? And we've given you some options there: less than 33%, 33 to 66%, 66 to 95%, or more than 95%. So we'll give you a minute to answer related to the percentage you've dispersed. Okay, great. So we have about 40% of you have said more than 95% of your student share has already been dispersed. And then another 40% of you have indicated that it's somewhere between 66 and 95%. And this is consistent with some findings that we saw from a recent webinar from NASFA, where additionally there, about half had dispersed nearly all of their money. And one note here that we'll mention: in a recent frequently asked questions document from the department, institutions asked about potential consequences related to drawing down the full amount for the student aid package and not having dispersed it yet. And so, because they hadn't distributed it as quickly as they had planned. So I think one of the keys there is to make sure that you have kind of records of the distribution you've already done and plans for the future distributions in case there are inquiries about your distribution. And then, from the Department of Education standpoint, they provided guidance in this FAQ, kind of circling back with uniform guidance about federal grants and requirements related to federal grants, indicating that grantees have to minimize the time between drawing down and dispersing. So again, this is something to consider as you're managing that student portion. So, of course, with both the institutional share and the student share, there are requirements for how the money can be spent. And so in sections 18004A1 and C, the institutions of higher education can use up to 50% of the funds that they have received for this institutional share to cover any costs associated with, and this is kind of the key language, significant changes to the delivery of instruction due to the coronavirus. So that is the nexus that always kind of needs to be there between the spending and the changes that have resulted, because of COVID-19. So on April 21st, when Secretary DeVos announced information about how to access this second tranche of funding for institutions, there were some directives included there about how institutions can spend these funds for recipients' institutional costs. And in terms of the criteria, institutions have to have already applied for the student share of the CARES Act or the HERF funding, and then they also had to sign a certification and agreement for the institutional portion. And this agreement also served as an important guide for the spending of the funds and how they can be spent. So again, through the permissible spending has been dictated then through the certification and agreement and has been updated through announcements from the department and through frequently asked questions documents. So here we've listed several items of permissible spending, and there are some caveats, of course, with respect to some of these permissible areas of spending. So institutions can use funds to provide refunds to students for room and board, tuition, and other fees, again, as a result of there's that nexus to significant changes to the delivery of instruction. But a caveat there is that institutions can't reimburse themselves from the funds that are in the student share bucket, but rather that has to be from the institutional share portion of HERF. In addition, institutions can use the funds to purchase equipment or software, of course, for the significant shift that institutions have to implement, moving to online learning. So that could be, fees or other services related to that shift in the actual education delivery. And again, another caveat that there has to be a distinction between what was done as a result of changes because of COVID, and not, previously planned upgrades to computer systems, for example. And then additionally, these funds can be used, of course, to purchase essentials such as thermometers, cleaning supplies, other things related to sanitizing and monitoring related to COVID-19, and then costs for non-permanent changes to existing facilities, for example, to implement social distancing measures in classrooms. And then just to add a few more here, from the recent FAQ again on October 2nd, institutions had asked about using institutional funds as reimbursement for instructor vacation buyouts, indicating that there were staff that took very little time off in the spring as institutions were pivoting to distance learning and implementing many other measures related to COVID-19, and that even into the fall, instructors have had to cover extended campus hours because of added classes to accommodate social distancing or to make up other lost classroom time. And so institutions were asking about whether it could offer a buyout of an additional week of PTO for its instructors, and the department indicated that that is a permissible expenditure. And then again, because of a nexus to significant changes due to the delivery of instruction, salaries and benefits for employees that worked in dining halls and dorms who would have otherwise been paid is a permissible expenditure. And then also included in that recent FAQ document, the department indicated that it is a permissible expenditure to hire additional personnel for COVID-related work. And again, as sort of a institutional control or monitoring piece, the department noted that if an employee's duties are only partially, to address and respond to the changes as a result of COVID, then only those funds that relate to that work can be from the HERF fund. So they should be prorated to make sure that there's only covering kind of that nexus to the significant changes due to COVID. And then also in the certification and agreement and in other guidance from the department, we've gathered, of course, information about impermissible spending. So it can't be, the HERF funds can't be used for the provision of pre-enrollment recruitment activities, including marketing and advertising. can't be used for financial aid grants to students who were enrolled exclusively in online programs before the pandemic. And then explicitly, it can't be used to cover losses in revenue. And again, this relates to the tranche that we're talking about under subsection A1. There are some differences under A2 and A3, which again we'll note when we're looking at the form. And then again, explicitly in the certificate and agreement for the institutional portion, the department advised that the funds cannot be used for senior administrator and or executive salaries and benefits and bonuses to senior administrator types, even though there may have been changes to the types of work they were required to do, that is not a permissible expenditure under HERF. So now we'll move from administration to reporting. So with respect to the student share, there was initial reporting that was required under Section 18004E, and that was an initial 30-day period to cover 7 different categories that institutions had to publicly report about the student share. And then there was a Federal Register notice on August 31st, which decreased the frequency of that reporting. So it became a quarterly basis for these reports about the student share. So an updated report about the emergency financial aid grants to students were due to be posted on October 10th to institutions' websites. And then again, now that becomes a quarterly reporting obligation. And the timing again changed as a result of this Federal Register notice, but the categories of what has to be reported has remained the same. Some of the numbers will change, some of them will not. There's some acknowledgments about signing the certification and agreement, which of course will remain. But then some of the numbers, of course, about what has been dispersed will change during these quarterly reports. And then there was one clarification related to student eligibility that we wanted to highlight in this October 3rd FAQ document. And that is to say that the department said that there may have been some imprecise language about students filing the FAFSA and whether they were eligible. And the department clarified that an individual does not need to demonstrate that they qualify for a Pell Grant in order to qualify for HERF student share funds, but rather has to demonstrate that they are eligible to file a FAFSA and eligible to participate in Title IV programs. And then next, with respect to the reporting on the institutional share, institutions were advised, from the beginning of the release of these funds that there would be reporting requirements that would be forthcoming. Some of those were indicated in the FAQ, and then the department stated that as time progressed, information would come out in the Federal Register about this reporting. But at the beginning, when the department released these funds, they advised that institutions should be prepared to report, demonstrating that the use was in accordance with the CARES Act, that institutions should be prepared to describe any internal controls that they have in place to ensure that the funds are used for allowable purposes and with good cash management principles, and then, of course, that they need to keep detailed records about how they're expending the funds. And the department has consistently stated that the grant funds awarded under HERF are, of course, subject to the requirements of uniform guidance in 2 CFR Part 200, which covers retention requirements for records related to all federal awards. So the department has provided a final quarterly budget and expenditure reporting form, which institutions will now use to report on their expenditures under the institutional share. And the first report is due to be publicly posted on institutional websites by October 30th, in just a few days, and this will cover the period from the date of the first HERF grant award through September 30th. And so this form, was subject to public comment and then now is in its final version. And we're just going to kind of screen share here to show you what the form looks like. Again, it lists out various categories of permissible expenditures so that institutions can identify the expenditure and specify the amount. You'll note that there are areas that are grayed out if a particular portion is not applicable under A1, A2, or A3. An example of that is here with lost revenue being grayed out. And so again, institutions will be using this form to do this quarterly reporting on the institutional funds. There's also a section for other categories of expenditures with instructions for institutions to include explanatory notes about these expenditures and supporting documentation. And then finally, with respect to annual reporting, the department has indicated that there will be an intended first annual report due in early 2021, covering the expenditure of all HERF grant funds in the calendar year from 2020. But that's not yet finalized. And then here we've just noted that the department has a reporting requirements table on its website, which includes this annual reporting, but also the reporting related to the student share and the institutional share, which can be a helpful guide for you and your staff as you're preparing these reports. And then with respect to the grant performance period, the grant performance period is 1 year, and the department has indicated that after the performance period, it can, reclaim unspent funds, and reiterated that institutions were given 1 year from the grant award notification in order to extend the funds under HERF. And it notes that the purpose is to cover costs and losses associated with an emergency, and so that's the rationale for kind of expending the funds close in time to the beginning of the pandemic. However, the department indicated that it understands that there are changes in enrollment levels and that institutions may need to reserve some funds in the event that the emergency continues to be prolonged. And so there are no-cost extensions of up to 12 months available, and so institutions can take advantage of those as needed. And then with respect to oversight, so clearly under the CARES Act and the HERF funds, the department has responsibility for allocating billions of dollars to help with the impact of COVID-19. And the Office of Inspector General has been charged with oversight to ensure that the funds are used as required and that they reach the intended recipients. In addition, the CARES Act establishes the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee, which is composed of inspectors general from across the federal government, and this includes the Inspector General from the Department of Education. And this group is tasked with coordinating the inspectors general who are overseeing the $2 trillion package in emergency federal spending to address COVID. And then in investigating misuse and theft and other criminal activity, OIG, of course, advises to be wary of fraud and has released publications about some of the warning signs related to fraud or misuse of funds under the CARES Act. And then finally, institutions, of course, want to be prepared for enforcement and audits related to the CARES Act administration. At the beginning of the pandemic, there certainly seemed to be a shared sense that institutions were doing the best they could to adjust and make reasonable changes, that were required due to the pandemic. And we're, unsure exactly what audits or enforcement will look like. But in the August 31st Federal Register update, there was language about, that institutions that the department determines have not met the reporting requirement as described in the notice may be subject to enforcement actions up to and including being determined to be ineligible for other CARES Act program funding. And then in September 10th report, the OIG summarized its review of some of the challenges faced by ED in overseeing institutional administration and spending under the CARES Act. And the report referenced prior audits of ED's monitoring and oversight of grants programs and discussed the need for internal controls, training, and technical assistance and for guidance to recipients to ensure that the grantees are properly safeguarding and using the federal education funds. So in referencing past grant monitoring as examples, OIG discussed the need for the department to provide guidance and training and technical assistance. And we've been seeing this with the announcements that we've been getting, the electronic announcements with frequent updates, forms, and webinars from the department. Okay, and now we're going to move on to our next poll question. Do the COVID-19 distance education flexibilities apply to the 2021 award year? And this is our transition into flexibilities that the department has announced related to aid. And so we'll give you a moment to answer that question. Yes, no, or it depends.
This question brings up an important reminder that if your school has taken advantage of these flexibilities that the department has offered to, keep these deadlines on your calendar and be thinking about that as we go through. Let's see what the results are. Right. So we have about 33% saying yes, 5 no, and almost 70% it depends, which is always the answer when it's about Title IV in particular. But it depends. It's probably the right answer. It's actually yes, as long as payment periods meet the conditions and the time frames that are required. So this is Lisa Hoskins. I'm a consultant with Husch Blackwell, and so I'm going to just talk about some of the flexibilities and practicalities that we are seeing and hearing from you all, and also just to put some things on the top of your mind that might be helpful for your institutions. Many of you are already institutions that have approval to offer distance education, but for those of you who are not, your institutions who took advantage of this emergency measure to accommodate students to continue their coursework may need to keep in mind that at this point, the time frame for the distance education flexibilities that were allowed in the March 5th electronic announcement and continuing guidance, at this point, they can continue through the payment period that includes December 31st. And the language that has been used is, or the end of the payment period that includes the end date for the federally declared qualifying emergency related to COVID-19. So seeing as we are almost there really already, December 31st is the date that approval and flexibility will continue until pending any further guidance that we may receive. So we wanted to just talk a little bit about a few topics related to distance education on a high level. In addition to that emergency measure, some other matters that have come up relate to, for example, students who move off campus suddenly, whether it's your entire institution or that just a few students who are affected. And the department has mentioned that you do not have to make or reevaluate the student's cost of attendance when they do so, even if you offer refunds or waivers of expenses for tuition, fees, room and board, or other charges. You may continue to do that. If, however, you have planned for your campus to make wholesale changes to have everyone move off campus, I think the expectation is that your cost of attendance should have been devised as closely with that calendar as possible in the first place, but you can continue to use waivers for unexpected disturbances and changes on campus. So a tip on this is just to add that you continue to pay any Title IV refunds that are created by this action, any actions you take on refunds according to the cash management regs. So continue to monitor that and issue those to students as necessary. And the third matter we want to bring up is that the final rule that was just published last month redefines the portion of distance education previously requiring predictable and regular interaction, substantive interaction, and has changed that to a predictable and scheduled basis. And so this is to say that the institution is ensuring that students have the opportunity for substantive interaction with instructors, but it's giving a little bit leeway to use groups of instructors for courses, and is providing just a little bit more flexibility. So if you are a school that has taken advantage, I want to just add, if you have taken advantage of the institutional eligibility using distance education flexibility, you can contact your case team at caseteams@ed.gov if you want to discuss your particular institution and talk to them about what would be necessary for you to continue should you need to be planning for the spring semester, and that's kind of an unknown at this point. Everyone's favorite topic, return to Title IV. I know all of you college presidents are so excited to talk about this. However, we do want to just highlight a few things related to return to Title IV. In the spring, when initially everything was allowed, you could use waivers, assuming that students were withdrawing due to the pandemic. And that can be the case on some campuses continuing on. However, there are some changes for the current time frame that we're talking about this fall for the 2020-21 school year, where you may not be able to use that waiver as freely. So I want to talk about that. An institution is not required to return to Title IV funds for any student who begins attendance in a payment period or period of enrollment that includes March 13th through the later of December 31st, or the last date that the national emergency is in effect, and subsequently withdraws from the period as a result of COVID-19 related circumstances. And so the importance is that the important change to note is that students enrolled in a program, that students may actually have withdrawn for non-COVID related reasons this term. Schools may need to request a student attestation explaining why the withdrawal was COVID related in order to qualify for the benefits of a return to Title IV. Changes have also been made to return to Title IV withdrawal from modules as a result of the final rule that was published in September. Students who are enrolled in a program offered in modules are no longer considered withdrawn, the same as they have been for return to Title IV purposes if their module are long enough, are 49% or more of the payment period, or the combination of their modules when combined equal at least 49% of a payment period. This is important because prior to this, students who took programs offered in modules may have been considered to have withdrawn if they didn't complete all of their modules. And so that This is effective July 1st, 2021, and you can opt in early, but generally speaking, early implementation may be at odds with our current environment of students being affected by COVID. So if you are considering early implementation, you may want to run some scenarios, get some advice specifically about whether that's best for your students or not. Another area that we've had a lot of questions regarding is campus-based aid, and in particular federal work study. Federal work study has obviously been impacted more than the other aid programs just due to the work requirement, and most of those work requirements have been in person historically. So the flexibilities related to federal work study have continued into the 2020-21 academic year. Students may work remotely as approved by your institution. The institutional community service expenditures have been waived, continuing into this current aid year. There's also, if students are unable to work their work-study job due to COVID-related interruptions, schools may continue to pay them for their scheduled hours. You should continue to maintain documentation such as timesheet, how those federal work study payments are calculated, and it's best practice to have supervisors involved in and still approving those when feasible. So with work study in general, an important question has come up about COVID-related disruptions. And you can see where there has been guidance that COVID-related disruptions are if your campus closes or temporarily ceases instruction, the campus moves classes from ground-based to online, federal work study student is employed by an employer that temporarily or permanently closes, the student is quarantined and unable to travel to campus or job site, or other such disruptions due to COVID-19. For many of you, you're getting ready to complete, or you just have completed your FISAP. There are technical assistance webinars from the department directly about how to complete that FISAP. I know that NASFA has also published a lot of FAQs regarding that completing your FISAP in this unusual year.
And Lisa, we had a question come in for you, which is if you have decided that you're going to shut down the campus after Thanksgiving and have everybody go online, do we have guidance on whether you can continue to pay your federal work study students who can no longer work because now you're online?
That's a great question. Essentially, the question is what constitutes a COVID-related campus disruption? Does, ostensibly you have changed your semester plan ahead of time because of COVID, but does that count? And so we understand from guidance that NASFA's received directly from ED that a pre-planned change in instruction method, like moving online after Thanksgiving, for example, may not actually be the same thing as a campus disruption as if you were going to continue and then made the determination to shut down your campus. We're going to be watching for clarification from ED, but you may need to be careful on that use of the waiver when paying students federal work study awards if you have pre-planned some kind of change in your delivery method.
Thank you, Lisa. One thing we just wanted to make sure to note, we're sure that most all of you are aware of this, And we have a deep dive webinar coming up where we'll talk exclusively about the rescission of the Clery Handbook, so I'm not going to spend much time on it at all, but just wanted to make sure you were all aware of the rescission of the Clery Handbook. So in achieving compliance with Clery Act regulations, of course, institutions have historically relied a great deal on the Clery Handbook, approximately 265-page document providing guidance about Clery reporting and warnings and notifications. But on October 9th, the department rescinded and replaced that handbook with a 13-page appendix to the Federal Student Aid Handbook. And some of the significant changes include guidance around how to define Clery geography, Clery crimes, and how to identify campus security authorities. Basically, the overarching idea is that perhaps as a result of reliance on the Clery Handbook, some of those categories were expanded further than the regulation requires. And so, again, we're going to have a deep dive into those issues, but wanted to make sure that we at least mentioned it today. And there is no change to the extension of the 2020 due date for the ASR. That is still December 31st of this year.
Speaking of interesting developments from the Department of Education, we have your next core question, which is, have any external entities or individuals asked your institutions about scholarships restricted to or with a preference for students of a particular sex or gender in recent history? We'll say in the last year or so. This has been an area where we've seen quite a bit of action from the Department of Education recently, and we're going to talk a little bit more about it. And we're wondering, because we've had several clients ask about it, if we're seeing similar trends in the audience. And we've got a fairly good split here. We have 30% who have been asked, about 23 who haven't been asked, and then several of you don't know, probably because it's not part of your role to respond to those kinds of inquiries. So let's talk about single-sex scholarships, and I'm going to use the word sex because that's the word used in Title IX and the current regulations, which were written in the 1980s, and now we'd probably use the word gender. We do recognize the difference, but we're talking about scholarships that are restricted to either females or males receiving them or have a preference for females or males receiving them. The good news is that they are not in and of themselves illegal. The Title IX regulations discuss the amount of involvement that your schools can have in either administering these or just providing students with information about them. The regulations specifically say that if you have a scholarship that was created by a legal instrument, so by a will or a gift agreement by a donor, that you can honor those restrictions provided you have policies and procedures that allow for students to be selected to receive scholarships without reference to their sex. Then they're paired with scholarships for which they qualify, and no student is denied an award because of sex. This is referred to as the pool and match approach. So you get all of your students, regardless of their sex, into a pool. You decide who merits getting an award, and then you match those students to the awards that they fit. So usually you start with your least restrictive scholarships, and you would award it to, the person of a certain religion who is also a female who is from some small town in Kansas. That's a pretty restrictive scholarship. You'd award that first, and then you'd go on to award other scholarships to students who met different qualifications, and you'd end with scholarships that didn't really have any restrictions like that, ensuring that no student is denied an award based on their sex. And when you read these regulations, at least other parts of the regulations, in combination with what is very limited guidance from the Department of Education, they suggest that institutions can't provide substantial assistance to outside entities who offer these scholarships. So we're not talking about internal scholarships. They're often foundation scholarships, especially for public institutions, that you as a school provide directly to your students. We're talking about listing scholarships on your website, maybe providing a pamphlet about it. arguably the regulations would might allow for that, depending on how the department decides it wants to interpret its own regulations, provided you're not offering substantial assistance. Now, there are some people who disagree with that particular interpretation, and starting last fall, an organization called SAVE, which may actually be one person, started sending letters to institutions saying, we see on your website that you're administering scholarships for women and only focused on scholarships for women, and that you're listing scholarships for women on your website even if they're provided by outside entities, and I want you to tell me why you're not violating Title IX by doing that. Some schools responded, some didn't, and then this organization started filing complaints with the Office for Civil Rights of the Department of Education, and the Office for Civil Rights decided this spring, which was an interesting time to do it, that it would start following up on these complaints, start investigating institutions for either administering these scholarships or listing them on their website. And in terms of enforcement, I'm going to hand it over to my former OCR attorney colleague, Ms. Samples, to tell you more about what the department has been doing.
So yes, as Annie said, we started to see in the spring a series of notifications from the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights about these investigations, again, mostly prompted by these SAVE complaints. And so, SAVE would identify that the scholarships that they believe are in violation of Title IX. OCR has been vetting during evaluation some of those scholarships and then notifying institutions of the scholarships that are going to be the subject of the investigation. So then once an institution is notified of the complaint investigation, they are asked to prepare a response. Sometimes there's been some discussion about early resolution through voluntary agreements with the department, but in preparing a response, institutions really have to gather detailed information about the administration of these scholarships, gathering data about, again, both the awards and history of the awards, and then also gathering information about procedures from advancement and scholarship staff about how these are advertised and how they're determined and awarded. So if you haven't already received a notice of one of these investigations, we would consider using opportunities to kind of take stock around these types of scholarships and kind of trying to determine what are institutional goals around these types of scholarships, or taking an inventory of around them, and then looking at policies and procedures for donor-based agreements and methods of administering or listing them on the website. There's options to offer donors related to these types of scholarships, and so there's language and kind of parameters that your advancement offices can discuss with donors about these types of restrictions. Sometimes there are just simply logistical issues with rewarding scholarships when the criteria are overly narrow. And so really just having discussions, again, with those offices and with some of your donors ahead of time about the types of scholarship agreements that you are willing to enter into. And then appointing ownership for monitoring these types of scholarships and related guidance is also really useful.
So Elizabeth, I have a question. What sort of enforcement resolution are you seeing around this?
So in terms of the investigations, we're not seeing yet them kind of come to determination. That is, what OCR would typically find as a letter of finding and determination. So that is still kind of in progress in terms of the actual investigations. We are seeing, the department suggest, again, those are voluntary resolution agreements, and we've seen some changes to those. For a period of time there, we had just kind of one to sort of refer to as what the department might be requiring in terms of resolving a matter through an agreement like that. Now we're seeing kind of a shift to different categories of these agreements. So I think, we'll see how institutions kind of determine, for themselves what is the best way to kind of resolve these issues.
And next up, we have income share agreements. This is another area where we're seeing some movement. We're seeing schools moving forward with income share agreements, and that's been particularly in the last year. These are arrangements where typically an institution or a private entity extends either credit or dollars to students to fund their education. In exchange, the students agree to repay those funds at a rate that varies depending on the amount of income they make after they've presumably graduated or left the institution. There are a lot of variations to these kinds of plans, but that's the basics. So you give me money, I get an education, hopefully I get a job, and I give you some percentage of what I earn until I've paid back the money, and usually some sort of interest or some sort of fee. This is one area of innovative education funding. We're definitely seeing institutions move to support students in doing this, to help them fund their educations, to relieve some of the burden of their debt. But depending on the way the deals are structured, they also give heartburn to your very risk-averse Title IV student funding lawyers, because there's no real comprehensive regulatory scheme around them. Illinois did recently pass a law that gave the state treasurer authority to invest in certain income share agreements, and at least one attorney who has been kind enough to go back and forth with me on these in my effort to find a way to make them happen, has said that he thinks that this new Illinois regulatory scheme, at least when it comes to Illinois law, makes it less risky for institutions to enter into these income share agreements. And I do hope that that's the case, but there are still a lot of open questions around them, most notably whether they're loans. And when you have a loan, you are often subject to state and federal lending laws. And less obviously, these can raise questions about whether people who enter into them are purchasing securities. And in the securities realm, compliance violations can carry some really serious, significant liabilities. There are also concerns that somehow these might be discriminatory in that they favor, according to those who think they might be discriminatory, certain majors that tend to be less accessible to certain groups of people, so they tend to go to business majors or sort of high-dollar return fields, and they don't fund other types of fields that would be more accessible to some people. And certainly we don't have any clear guidance on how they should be considered from either a tax perspective or a financial aid perspective when it comes to awarding funds to students. What I need to sleep better at night is a clear, comprehensive federal regulatory scheme that preempts state and other federal laws and clarifies what rules apply. There is some pending legislation in Congress. I won't say it's my dream legislation, but it does go some of the way to getting us there. There seems to be at least some bipartisan support around this innovative way to create accessibility to education. ISAs are being implemented at schools. Schools have decided, you know what, we get that there's risk, but we're going to take it to make our education more accessible to students. And I wouldn't be surprised if we start to see at least some more regulatory clarity, either at more state levels or in the federal realm in the coming years. Our next slide is really here as a resource and reminder to you that as of July 1st, you are supposed to be making professional licensure disclosures for any program you have that is designed to lead to professional licensure or certification, whether it's an online program, and we've had professional licensure disclosure requirements around them for a long time, but now also on-ground programs. You have three types of disclosures you need to be making: public disclosures for any student who is located for all of the states in which your students or prospective students are located. You need to be saying whether a program meets, does not meet, or can't be determined to meet that state's licensure requirements. You also need to make individualized disclosures to students who've expressed interest in a particular program, and if you find out once students are already enrolled that a program doesn't meet the requirements for their state, you need to give them notice of that as well. So in short, make sure that you're making those disclosures. Make sure you cast a wide net in considering which programs are professional licensure programs. The obvious ones are health professions or teacher certification programs. The less obvious ones might be programs like engineering or counseling. Sometimes you have to do a little bit of digging to find out whether your program is designed to lead to professional licensure.
As we're talking about this changing landscape, COVID-19 has obviously accelerated some changes that were already occurring in the higher ed landscape, and we've seen many institutions grappling with the best way to proceed in light of the financial hardships imposed on institutions, enrollment, and students in these unpredictable times. So other schools are seeking to actually expand their missions and increasing their footprint into new areas or partnerships. So this kind of change almost always requires institutions to jump through at least some federal aid and accreditation hoops. Speaking from experience, it's important that you are continuing to update the Department of Education via your program participation agreement. Any time that you have major changes, you can also inquire if you're unsure. As you're making some changes, it's always better to ask ahead of time than to be denied afterwards. So if you're considering teaming up with another institution to offer new and innovative programming, know that there are certain elements that usually need to be included in your written agreements that aren't always intuitive, and others that it's simply advisable to have. Closing, buying, selling institutions require things like teach-out plans and accreditor, state Department of Education, notifications and approvals, some of which can take a very long time to obtain. To best position yourselves to move quickly on these kinds of actions, be sure that you're involving your accreditation and financial aid teams early so you can get an early start and complete the transactions in a timely and complete manner.
And next up we have foreign source reporting. I could fuss at you for a whole hour on this issue, but I see we're running out of time. So I will give you the short version, which is that institutions have been required for a long time to report foreign gifts or contracts, which in the aggregate are $250,000 or more in a 12-month period. The Department of Education very concerned about the influence of China in particular on U.S. research and education, for the first time decided to move on this early last year and issued a couple of information collection requests. There's a proposed rule pending out there that asks for true copies of gift agreements or contracts with foreign sources. The department last week unveiled its report, which resulted, I think, in part from its new reporting system and its current drive to see reporting that talks about, among other things, I'll quote, "The industry has at once massively underreported while also anonymizing much of the money it did not disclose, all to hide foreign sources and correspondingly their influence on campus from the department and the public." It's launched a number of investigations against institutions that it thinks are not complying with foreign source reporting obligations. The clear message from the Department of Education is to make sure that you are complying with your foreign source reporting obligations using its new reporting system so that we can all understand what's going on with this issue. It has recently issued a notice of interpretation, which hasn't yet been published in the Federal Register, that now ties this issue directly to your student funding. The department is taking the position that in your program participation agreement for Title IV programs, you have agreed to comply with all of the department's information collection requests to its satisfaction, and that therefore you have to comply with foreign source reporting as well as any investigations of your foreign source reporting to its satisfaction as a condition of participating in Title IV programs. Speaking of accountability issues, if I can set my mouse work, I will move to the next slide for you. Borrower defense to repayment, very quickly, I think it was last week or the week before, a judge rejected the proposed settlement between the department, which had been asked to enforce the Obama-era borrower defense regulations because the department was simply dismissing over, I think it was 160,000 borrower defense claims out of pocket without explaining why it was doing so. The court said that this sort of action would risk students, could potentially cause serious harm to students, so it wouldn't approve the settlement. We expect to see some more movement in this area, regardless of what happens in the upcoming election. Speaking of the upcoming election, people have been asking us what's going to happen. If you have a crystal ball telling me what's going to happen in the next 6 weeks, I would love to borrow it. We do expect that we'll see a shift in department priorities. We'll see a shift in administration, particularly around the area of consumer protections and reporting things like cohort default rates and employment rates, maybe even a comeback for gainful employment, and also maybe some movement around incentive compensation to close what people see as a loophole, allowing institutions to enter what are called bundled services agreements that allow them to pay, to some extent, a commission to those who are recruiting students based on the number of students who are recruited.
And just a quick legislative update to conclude. We had much in the news, of course, about the HEROES Act, Health and Economic Recovery Omnibus Emergency Solutions, passed by the House in May and then now revised at the end of September, which was significantly pared down to $2.2 trillion. This is a massive stimulus bill that obviously impacts a huge range of areas, including higher education. And actually, with respect to the higher education portion, the two sides are not that far off with respect to the $30 billion that will be hopefully at some point awarded for higher education institutions. But the timeline to passage, of course, is uncertain given the upcoming election and now the Senate being adjourned. So we will stay tuned for updates related to HEROES, and then also with respect to the Higher Education Act, of course, that continues to be up for renewal, and we may see some movement there in the future.
And just very quickly, we do have a lot of uncertainty around the HEROES Act and other things that are happening, but we've also talked about several very certain developments in the area of student funding. This is just a calendar update slide to bring it all together. It maps out some of those obligations over the coming year unless we see more changes, and we put it here as a resource for you.
All right. Well, thank you again so much for joining us today. We hope this information was helpful to you and to your institution. As a reminder, the program's been approved for CLE hours, so make sure to visit the CEU icon if you want to take advantage of that. And a reminder to complete our short survey. And then please join us for our next webinar, November 9th, as promised, on Clery updates. Thank you very much.